Howdy, all of you delicious people. I am here today to review A Family Man. So, this is a Gerard Butler film that at the end of the day, I could just say that I've seen. I think reasonably for this one, it's just kind of a movie that kind of goes way too far into somebody being so tied into their job that ultimately it costs them. It costs them everything. Like when looking at the Matthew McConaughey movie, like Two for the Money, where we have it to where Matthew McConaughey is really good at guessing which sports teams are going to win or not, to the point of when he gets to 100% of guessing every single team correct to a T, that eventually he loses that ability because reasonably. Um, like he is so encapsulated into guessing things correctly and everything else around him is utterly a lie that justifiably he loses his edge. Where in this movie we ultimately have Dane's character, who is played by Gerard Butler, who is ultimately seeing his life kind of slip away from him, or realizing that he's in a rut with his life, just because reasonably he's never home. He's never really a part of that life. He's just so 100% consumed with his job, to the point of him needing to drop whatever he does just to do his job. To ultimately, it's like, what kind of life is that exactly? We ultimately have to where, when looking at it, too, Gerard Butler's character has to convey to people like how stressful his job is, but also like, aren't you happy that I've made like so much money for our family and I've been able to provide and this and that? It's like why are you so bitter about things? Why are you so bitter about my job when ultimately it has afforded us any number of things and so on and so forth? But we have it to where, considering Gerard Butler's character is a real like neglectful father, to the point of um, we have it to where at some points he's really just ragging on his son, and ultimately that eventually does blow up in his face, and because we just have a very neglectful parent that ultimately doesn't realize till it's too late what is going on with his son. Like a lot of times we probably just have parents that um, ultimately like notice a thing here and there, but obviously like won't do anything about it, just because it's just like, well, maybe it's just maybe it's just this, or maybe it's just that. But when really looking at it, it's like, well, maybe it's just because you haven't been observant enough. So going into this, let's ultimately, like, we have it to where Gerard Butler's character is a headhunter, and that's really all that really matters in this movie. We have it to where reasonably Gerard Butler's character eventually has to re-win over people that ultimately he has either neglected or otherwise just uh, tried to use at some point to the benefit of himself. And we have it to where Gerard Butler's character is ultimately kind of cheating through his job. And we have it to where ultimately we have Lynn, who is Alison Brie, that, like, I thought that this was kind of a very interesting choice to kind of have Alison Brie be like the opposite rung of Gerard Butler's character, because they're two headhunters that are like kind of competing for a higher position, because we end up having uh, Willem Dafoe's character that is ultimately going and leaving this job at some point. So ultimately, that's all that I think I wanted to say about this movie in a very cryptic like sense. It's just kind of like, for most of the point, I guess it could be like a feel good kind of film at the tail end of this movie, but when really looking at it, it's for the most point just kind of an arduous process to watch, just because of how just um, we have it to where either Gerard Butler is kind of ragging on his son, or he's ultimately just kind of just really ragging on the fact that like yeah, he does an amazing job at what he does, but when looking at it, like that's not going to ultimately get his wife enthused about being able to, let's just say, perform for her husband. So let's go into that double five to otherwise go into here and ultimately go into this movie. So spoiler time. It's about that time I'm going to spoil this movie. So we ultimately have it to where Gerard Butler is the biggest thing about him is to be a headhunter, and we have it to where we have a very experienced guy that is to ultimately go into a company and try and vie for a job. And so, reasonably, that experienced guy is going to be like a uh, is going to be a buffer for what is to actually be the person that actually does go into the job, um, and have a lot more knowledge about what these people are looking for. And ultimately, we have it to where Lou Wheeler, who is Alfred uh, Molina, he is that buffer character that is really just kind of waiting for a job to pan out for him. And it never will, because ultimately Gerard Butler is trying to get a younger guy that is what they actually want into the job. So we ultimately have it to where we have Lou's character that is consistently going to his wife and he's like yeah, I still haven't found work yet, and ultimately we have it to where it seems like they're kind of like getting to the point of really thinking about uh trying to find other work or something like that. So we have it to where Dane's character ultimately is getting commissioned for some job, uh, and or he's getting commissioned to hire people from these companies. Ultimately, he's talking to them, and he's talking to them like as if he's known him their whole life, which he doesn't. But he just knows how to just kind of talk them into anything. He's easily being able to persuade all these people to do what he wants. And so we have it to where ultimately Gerard's character is ultimately seemingly a person that has to get a certain amount of commission sales for that month. And we have it to where ultimately Gerard Butler ultimately wins the first month, then Lynn's character, who's Alison Brie, ultimately wins the second month for justifiable reasons. So we have it to where Dane's character ultimately is to go home and when he's not working consistently, and even at some points having to answer some phone calls to make a commissioned sale, because reasonably like his job never stops. So we ultimately have it to where Gerard Butler goes home and he is trying to have his wife give him a BJ. But we have it to where ultimately, like, her BJ is just kind of just really just a very unenthusiastic approach. To where reasonably we have it toward Gerard's character is ultimately complaining about how just kind of limp, let's just say, that the attempt was on Ellis's part. But it's like when looking at it, it's like, well, Ellis is just like, well, like you're never home. Like there's not much of a like a romantic approach to whatever we're doing. It's just kind of like just get it kind of done. And Dane's character is ultimately just like, well, like when I come home and when I want things, like I should be able to get like a a real effort being put into whatever kind of um, like uh, like bedroom business that I want. And because ultimately Dane is coming from it, the fact that it's like, well, like, hey, like I make so much money to afford else being able to stay home and take care of the kids, uh, and that ultimately, like, we can kind of tell that Dane is ultimately just like so stressed being working on his job, hence why asking for the BJ of sorts to ultimately just like, God, like no one could be able to do his kind of job, and that ultimately all the stuff that he's able to provide for this family makes him an American hero. And we ultimately have Elsa, who ends up smacking him with a pillow and just going like, wow, you really just oversold me on that, like about how like great you are and whatever, and like how could I stay mad at you when you're saying some goofy crap like that. And so we ultimately have it to where reasonably we have Gerard, who is actually on his time off, which is seemingly never. He's spending time with his kids, and we ultimately have it to where while Gerard Butler's character Dane is spending time with his kids, um, we are starting to realize that it seems like his son is starting to have these weird bruises. We ultimately have Else, who is mentioning that's like, yeah, like our son is getting some bruises, and I can't really quite understand where he's getting them from. And also we have Dane kind of mentioning that like, man, my son is getting like really fat. Like, why is he getting so fat? And and ultimately, like, we have Dane, who is wanting to uh, go out with his son to just kind of get him to run, just because it's like, yeah, like my son's like really unathletic, and so that's the reason why he's so fat. And like, my God, that's kind of a horrible thing to just say about your son. It's like, so what that he's fat? It's like, yeah, like he just probably doesn't have any friends or whatever, so he just like keeps to himself. And where could he really go, and this and that, and because you're in the city. So we have to ultimately, because of all these weird and odd bruises, we ultimately have Gerard's character, who takes his wife and him takes his wife to the doctor to kind of assess what these bruises are. And we find out that Dane's son ends up having cancer. And they're like, oh crap. It's like, well, like, we didn't think anything of it and whatever. And we ultimately have this doctor that it's like, yeah, this is like a this is like a cancer. And ultimately, like, it seems like both the parents were just kind of like godsmacked, and they were ultimately thinking it's like, well, like, I think we should probably get a second opinion. I don't think this is really what it is. And the doctor's like, no, it is, this is really what it is. So we have it to where we have Gerard, who is now crazily trying to spend as much time with his son as possible, because his son is fighting for his life, to where it's ultimately affecting his job, to where Gerard is wanting to take more time off to spend with his kid, because ultimately we have his wife the entire time that is ultimately telling him, it's like, why aren't you here more? It's like, if anything, like your son is really sick. Like, you should be spending more time with your son. And so ultimately we have Dane is taking his son out um, to see buildings, and ultimately to like try to find like the back history of all these buildings, because we find out that his son likes to draw buildings and stuff like that. And Dane's character is just kind of so happy that like his son has found something that he enjoys. Uh, we ultimately have it to where seemingly at some point when Dane is going into having a get together, this like family get together, we have it to where ultimately uh, Dane just freaking explodes. Because at some point we have Else, who is just like kind of adamantly going at Dane, and because ultimately he has to make a phone call to his boss on Thanksgiving, and Else mentions to Dane, it's like, seriously, even on Thanksgiving that you're going and you're calling your work, and Dane is like I'm sorry, but like my boss like doesn't think of this as Thanksgiving. He just thinks of it as Thursday. And Else is just like, oh my god, is this like why is it that your job is all consuming and this and that, and we have it to where Dane just freaking explodes at this dinner that ultimately he is like we have it to where his family is in the background just kind of eating and getting together and whatever, and we have it to where Dane is exploding upon his wife, ultimately mentioning that it's like, well, god dang it, it's like I'm 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 making so much effing money, and when looking at it, like I might as well be Santa Claus, the Easter Bunny, and so on and so forth, because like I'm the one that is bringing home the bacon kind of thing, and like you should be grateful that like I am putting so much effort into this job to make money for you and our family, and ultimately I'm just getting more bickering from you about what all little things that I do about my job, and like we have it to where Dane is ultimately trying to do his job, but we can just kind of see the amount of time that he stays away from his job, and we can just see that um, that Dane is ultimately seeing everything just slowly but surely slip away from him in the November month, because we have it to where ultimately uh, Dane is trying to get this higher position, which is ultimately William Defoe's job, because William Defoe is going out and just retiring and going on to some tropical island somewhere, to where ultimately his position is going to be left for either Dane or Lynn's character. And so we have it to where every month, whoever makes the most sales is ultimately going to be able to make Defoe's position. And so ultimately, we have it to where Dane wins October, but then loses November, because ultimately, slowly but surely, everything is kind of slipping away from him. Because reasonably, and that's the real problem that ultimately Dane has, is he's ultimately telling Else the truth that he's like, yeah, like I'm going to probably lose my job, um, because the amount of time that I'm staying at home. And that's where Elsa is just like, well, like why is your job so important to you? It's like bop bop bop, and that's what kind of starts this whole like of eventually Dane just blowing up at her. So we ultimately have it to where Dane goes into here and reasonably is just going like, you know what, like I'm going to lose everything anyways, so F it. I'm going to spend time with my son. I'm going to go and see buildings with him, and see the most beautiful buildings I can find. We ultimately have Else, who actually has a background story of one of these buildings, because she ultimately had worked on there, and Gerard and Dane's character didn't even have a clue of that she had worked at this building before, and it was so fascinating to have Dane just kind of going like, "Oh, okay, hey, well, um, like, isn't this great that like your mother has this whole backstory about this building?" So eventually, we have it to where Dane's son is ultimately getting weaker and sicker, and to where the point to where ultimately they need to have him at the hospital until he can get better. And eventually, it gets to the point to where even his heart stops, and they have to like restart his heart. So we ultimately get it to where reasonably Dane is going into December, and he already knows that he is going to lose December. And so basically, what he ends up doing is he ends up just kind of like throwing everything away. Um, because even at some point he had done some underhanded things to try to get his quota for those months, but now he's just like, you know what, like there's nothing I can do. If anything, there's uh like it's getting to the point of just like going like, man, like I'm just like I'm really enjoying the amount of time that I'm staying at home, and when looking at this job it's just like, well, it's just not worth it. So we have it to where ultimately Dane is going in and just because these jobs they of course need an engineer, and Dane is ultimately talking to some woman, and he's adamantly just going like, you know what, like I have this guy named Lou Wheeler that uh, he's ultimately very experienced. How about you just give the job to him? And because ultimately this guy has just been holding out for a job that is never going to come. So how about I just give you this job? How about I just give you this person that is ultimately experienced and knows what he's doing? And we have it to where this person is like, well, yeah, like I'm not going to take a risk on this person that ultimately is not going to give us so many years, and I'm not going to like we're not going to give you this commission for this employment. And we have it Dane is like, you know what, I don't care. Like just hire this person. He's the best person for the job, and like I don't care about the commission. So we have it Dane ultimately is to that being his very uh, last thing that he does for his job. So he ends up coming in the very next day to ultimately have William Defoe just like come on down. And we ultimately have it to where Defoe ultimately mentions like, well, I'm sorry about all this. We ultimately have it to where Lynn had just beat you this month, so as well as she has beaten you last month. So ultimately she doesn't want to work with you, so yeah, you're fired. So Dane is ultimately just like, well, that's great. If anything, uh if anything, we have it to where Dane kind of gives some shit to Defoe, but eventually after that he just leaves. And in the early portion before, we have it to where Defoe uh, wanted to fire somebody and ultimately had them sign a no complete clause. So ultimately, uh, they wouldn't try to like do their own company and kind of uh, try to outsmart Defoe. And so we have it to where ultimately Dane is going and seeing his kid at the hospital, and we have it to where Dane eventually has to tell his wife, it's like, hey, yeah, like I didn't take off the last day and the other day and this day and that day off of work to see you guys. If anything, in all honesty, I actually just lost my job. And Elsa is like, well, okay, fine. Like you hated that job anyways. And so we have it to where they're just like, well, like if anything, like it's just gonna have Dane being able to really and truly like spend more time with his family. And I love like this like tail end of this whole story, this whole movie, where we ultimately have it to where Dane ultimately goes and is his own man and kind of is being his own boss at home. And we have it to where Dane is ultimately uh, Dane is ultimately going and trying to do this same job that he was doing, but at home. And because ultimately we have Defoe that ultimately gives him a letter that it tears up that no compete clause thing, where ultimately that means that Dane can go and do whatever he wants anywhere he wants. And so you just kind of see Defoe just kind of smiling off to the distance, ultimately having a letter within that message that says "Good luck, Dane." To just be like, well, F it. Like, uh, Defoe is just realizing that it's like, well, hey, like he gave me crap, but if anything, he was right. So, and ultimately, I'm sure that Dane ended up calling and talking to Defoe on Thanksgiving, where ultimately probably Lynn would not have. But like that whole moment where Dane is talking to Defoe about family during Thanksgiving, and ultimately Defoe is just like, no, like no, I'm too tied to my work to even think about that. So we ultimately have it to where recently Dane is going and is doing this all from home, and I thought that this is like kind of a sweet, kind of fun moment. Um, and we ultimately have it to where Dane's son ends up coming back and being 100% fine uh, from him having cancer. And so everything is kind of coming up daisies and stuff like that. And ultimately, Dane is doing this from home. And funny enough, we have it to where Dane is ultimately being called by Lou. And so Lou is now a engineer at this place, and he's kind of really gotten his feet wet at this place, and everything is working solidly. And so Lou ends up like, well, yeah, but we need a couple of engineers for this job, and I'm hoping like you're the one that can help me get those because I'm only going to go to you and you alone. So we end up having Dane, who is going like, oh, okay, well, great, like, yeah, it's great that everything is working out with you and stuff like that, because we consistently have it to where Dane is going to Lou, and they're kind of having these sweet moments where ultimately Dane, when he's having problems at home, uh, we have it to where Lou is talking to Dane and ultimately mentioning that uh, oh, hey, are you having issues? And Dane's like, yeah, it's something at home. And ultimately just kind of Lou is kind of like talking into like, hey man, like I get it, like everybody has problems and so on and so forth, but hey, but if you really need to talk, and like Dane's like, yeah, I know, but like I'm just trying to make it through. So we have it to where reasonably these guys are kind of like a shoulder to cry on kind of thing if ultimately they kind of need it. Um, and yeah, it's like it's really fascinating to see these little moments that actually mean something towards the end of the film. So we ultimately have it to where and like I thought it was really interesting when Lou finally gets a call for this job, and he is ultimately going into his bathroom and just crying, but then ultimately then bizarrely thereafter that he's doing this like weird like air guitar thing, and he's like going like, yeah, like I got the job, and you can just see it on his face that he's just so elated, and it looks so awesome. And we ultimately have it to where Lou is telling his wife, it's like, hey, like, do you want to see our kids? Like, we can see them all the time. Because ultimately we're going to have money to be able to see them. And so, reasonably towards the tail end of this movie, we have it to where Dane is talking to Lou about him hiring somebody. Um, but recently he's like, well, like I'll tell you this one character, but like recently I desperately need to go into a very important meeting, and so recently I'll call you back in about an hour. So we have it to where Dane is ultimately that very severely important meeting that ultimately he's going to have is with his wife to ultimately sit down on the couch and just watch some TV for an hour. And like I thought that was like a beautiful ending to this movie, was to just have Dane ultimately just sitting next to his wife, and they're eating Chinese, and we have it to where Dane is like, hey, do you have the receipt for this? Do you have this receipt for this meal? Because ultimately it's a tax write off, and else just kind of laughs about it. And So I thought that this tail end of this movie was really interesting. I thought that this movie, like, there's some interesting moments in here, but it's kind of really kind of going through the arduous process of some of the heartbreaking moments as well, where we have Gerard Butler's character that is kind of like, like there's some portions in here where I'm just like, God, I don't like this portion of film, but there's like little small little things that ultimately I enjoyed out of this, and that's all I think that I could say at the end of the day. So I'm gonna get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.